Okay. Now, just a couple of little pieces of housekeeping. One is that, like Joe Biden, I stutter. As a result of that, I work from a script. So bear with me, we'll get there. Number two, some of these images you're going to look at and say, I can't read that. My answer to that is join the club. I couldn't read it either, and that was the whole point. Number three is, do we all sort of know about Shakers? Do we know about the difference between the Shakers and, say, the Amish in Pennsylvania? No. Okay, here we go. The Shakers were a sect that came off of the Quakers, to whom I belong. In the early 18th century, they believed in a God that was both male and female. They believed that they had found the female version of Jesus Christ. Their Sunday worship was based on shaking loose the sins of the world, which is how the word shaker came. Unfortunately, it's a whole lot easier to say than their name, which was the United Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, which you wouldn't want to have to say all the time. Anyway, they were persecuted in Britain. They moved to New York. Had a very harrowing sail from Manchester, and ultimately there were 18 communities strung between New England and Kentucky. There were 2 in Kentucky, 1 in Ohio, in North Union, and a bunch of them back east. That's generally who they were. They were a pacifist sect. They were one of the most forward-looking. They believed in equality among sexes, colors, just everybody. They just wanted to be separate. And that they had in common with the Amish. But basically, it was a whole different thing. A lot of people tend to think that the Amish and the Shakers are the same thing, which they're not. So anyway, this is my book. It's a slow read, but a good one. The photograph is not a girl. A lot of people think it's a girl. It's actually a photograph by Lewis Carroll of Arthur Hughes Jr. And he was this age during the time that I was writing the book. The book is written during. And that photograph was on my desk the whole time I was writing. So when I did the whole thing with the designer, he said, you can't use that, it's Lewis Carroll. I said, yes, we can. Yes, we can. So we will. And it was expensive, but we did it. So anyway, I will plunge headlong into this. I will try not to speak too quickly because that just trips me up even worse. But if you can't understand me, just say that again, because I get lost sometimes. Anyway, I love to drive. Not in traffic, of course, but I love road trips. For years, when I was working as a journalist in New York, I'd choose a spot on the map at random, a couple of times a year, then fly in for a couple of weeks and just take an aimless drive. One of my mystery destinations back in 1990, when we were all a lot younger, was Augusta in Maine. I thought, okay, I'll head up to Campobello, one of the Roosevelt estates. On the way there, I stopped in at Poland Spring, which is where Sabbath Day Lake is located. That is the home of the last 2 surviving Shakers, which that's what it used to look like. Doesn't look much different now. I've always been interested in religions. The more obscure, the better. Being a member of one, it makes sense. I wandered in, ended up in their library, and left with an obsession. Actually, it was a new aspect of an older obsession. I've nursed an active interest in the Civil War for years, the legacy of an 8th grade teacher who was the best I ever had. Now, you will all know that there's no apparent end to what can be known about the Civil War. Just look around here. In common with life itself, that war unfolded day by day, hour by hour, in thousands of locations. What I began to find in the library at Sabbath Day Lake was that during the Civil War, one particular Shaker community, South Union, was located quite literally at the crossroads of the bitterly contested western region of Kentucky. Boink. I mean, you can just see. It was north to Bowling Green, south to Russellville. They were right there. No place I could go. Extraordinary evidence of the tenterhooks on which these Shakers were suspended was dutifully recorded in journals kept by two of the community's members, Elder Harvey Eads and Eldris Nancy Moore. Unfortunately, the picture of the Harvey Eads is a lovely box photo, but Nancy didn't do as well. Dogged adherence to everything the Shakers held dear nearly destroyed South Union and its community, but it clearly never occurred to them to compromise their principles. Fittingly, the full manuscript journals are in the custody of Western Kentucky University's library in Bowling Green. But even the scattered bits I'd been able to read at Sabbath Day Lake indicated a chunk of undiscovered history that needed to be revealed. This is Brother Arnold Had. He's the last surviving, still alive, still lives there. When I told Arnold Had, the last surviving Shaker brother, that I was tempted to write a book about the Shakers during the Civil War, he looked me straight in the eye and said, "Don't do that. Please don't do that. Everyone gets it wrong." It seemed to me terribly sad that the Shakers have given so much to the world they live in. Washing machines, the circular saw, a zillion different farm implements. But they remain so completely misunderstood by pretty much anyone who's even heard of them in the first place. I couldn't have known then that 3 years later, I'd still be doing my dead level best to get it right for them. Indeed, fiction especially has been very hard on the Shakers. Most, if not all, of the novels that attempt to portray them zero in on the insistence on celibacy for all Shakers in the interest of living the lives of angels. There are Shaker mysteries and Shaker romance novels, don't ask. Even The Believers, written back in the 1950s and somehow considered to be the gold standard of Shaker fiction, depends on the celibacy issue to keep the plot afloat. Why did they run away from the Shakers? Why wouldn't they stay? You know, that sort of thing. When I left Brother Arnold at Sabbath Day Lake in Maine, I was just anxious to find the full Civil War journals of Elder Harvey and Eldris Betsy to see where they might take me. I'd found those traces of them in Maine that day in 1990, and a few months later, I found the rest of them in Bowling Green. Lord help us, that was just the beginning. Boink. These are just some samples. Eldris Betsy's was eventually actually edited. Harvey's is still just has been transcribed onto a typewriter. Tom Hanks would love it. But that's as far as it's gotten, which is a shame. Even before reading the journals, I'd been aware how complicated the Kentucky question was during that war. Lincoln feared that Kentucky would secede, which would put an end to the war right away. It just wouldn't. Anyway, it was a disaster just waiting to happen. A fire he hoped would burn itself out. The problem therefore dropped into the laps of better angels, in one case, literally. Eads and Moore's writings reveal a stunning microcosm of what it was like to be a pacifist sect caught between North and South, their lives and actions bound and determined by unshakable beliefs. Narratives of the path the Shakers traveled toward status as conscientious objectors and they were arguably the first in American history, make it seem that a simple visit to Lincoln was all it took. In actual fact, it took 3 years. Troops of North and South passed North and South, East and West, along those crossroads in their thousands, and the steadfastly pacifist Shakers treated all who asked for it with equivalent kindly welcome. Food, camping space, beds for the officers, even shoes at times. Records of those days were carefully kept to the penny, to the inch, as was the Shaker fashion. Even the weather, down to the depth of snowfall, was regularly noted. Remember that for me, this was 1990. There was no Google. Even cellular phones were in their infancy. However I proceeded, it meant doing research the old-fashioned way, by hand and in person. It didn't even sound easy. And as time went by, I became almost maniacal about accuracy. It's maybe just a journalist thing. Anyway, I spent 3 weeks in the library at Western Kentucky University examining the Civil War journals of Harvey Eads and Betsy Moore. They were, as I expected, meticulously kept. Too meticulously, in fact, and as time went by, one thing became mind-bendingly obvious. In order to do the subject justice, I might have to write South Union Civil War history as a novel. A novel meant a handful of carefully crafted characters would have to be turned loose in that meticulously recorded landscape. And with the sorry history of Shaker fiction in my rearview mirror, I was left on the horns of what I considered a near ethical dilemma. Just to be clear, I don't much like novels anyway, and I very seldom read them. Nonfiction is so much more interesting, and as Richard Nixon once said, it has the added merit of being true. But while the journals reveal much about those who'd written them, their writers' personalities couldn't be fully extrapolated from the entries. It was nobody's fault, just the way of the Shaker world. The entries are dazzlingly thorough, as Shaker records always were. So the lives behind them would have to be generally visible through the details. I could not take liberties with many of the historical residents of South Union without even the best of intentions getting it wrong. My choices were therefore two: edit the journals as they were, as scholarly, compelling Civil War documents, or craft a few characters and bring them to life in the world memorialized in those writings. I chose the second option, even knowing that I would need to be as historically accurate with my fictitious characters as I intended to be with the journals. Terrific. I just made a decision that would make things even more complicated. I felt honor-bound to get it all right. Full disclosure, even I know I carried the business of researching Kindly Welcome to almost lunatic extremes. First, I sub-edited the Shakers' Civil War journals into a book of days and a passage of time that either did or did not have a plot. Life, as we all know, doesn't have one. You get to the end of it, either something happened or it didn't. My fictional characters could only be fictional to a point, and every move they made had to be supported by well-researched fact. Which leads us to, has anybody seen the picture of Julia Child with the meat cleaver? You seen that? Always reminds me of that. Julia Neal, alas now dead, was a Western Kentucky professor who knew more about the Shakers than most other scholars will ever imagine, and had edited Eldris Betsy's journal, and she was a frequent and extraordinarily kind companion. She supplied me with minutiae never memorialized elsewhere, she knew that, like any journalist, I dreaded the coming of that letter that would say, actually, that isn't what happened. This is the center house at South Union. This is it as it was yesterday morning. It's like that. It is absolutely beautiful. The restoration that they've done there is astonishing. There's still a lot of it you can see. It's just south of Bowling Green. Well worth a visit, which is what I did. I spent days and days at what survives of this Shaker village at South Union. I paced the halls of the center house so that when my characters were moving around, they were always where they were supposed to be. This is the center house landing. And, wait a minute, is that the, I don't know. Anyway, all Shaker buildings were designed because men and women were equal. They were designed that if you took a meat cleaver and chopped them down the middle, it would be the same on either side. Men used one side, women used the other. The women never used the men's staircase or vice versa. But as I say, if you go there tomorrow, this is what it looks like, and it's well worth doing. I found old maps of the area because the South Union Shakers eventually owned 6,000 acres, and there were so many places they could be. These are just some, is anybody interested in these? These are just diagrams that I made of some of the rooms. This is a map of the village as it was from 1861 to 1865 and more either side. I drew diagrams, I measured distances. I was, long and short of it, a journalist on assignment. I'm just going to assume that you've all seen Seeing the Elephant. Everybody seen Seeing the Elephant? You should do that. It's great. A lot of the enlisted men referred to warfare as seeing the elephant, just going in and meeting themselves on that journey. But that metaphorical elephant exists in some form for everyone. We all have something or other we'd like to see or experience to make of life what we'd hoped it would be. But anyway, back to the elephant. The literal elephant, because I needed one to drop into a conversation between two of my fictional characters. The year is 1862. P.T. Barnum is in business, but he very seldom leaves New York. For research purposes, I needed an elephant, preferably still alive, not just in a touring circus, but a touring circus that played somewhere in the north central states. Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio. I could only afford to be vaguely finicky. The New York Public Library got me nowhere beyond tipping me to the existence of the Circus World Museum in Baraboo. A query to the nice people in Baraboo led me to just what I needed. If you ever need to sleep, this is the way to do it. A dazzling document called The Elephant in America, 1840 to 1860, by Stuart Thayer, the absolute oracle on that era. With that in hand, I was able to track down two elephants, Anthony and Cleopatra, who were imported from England, of all places, in 1857. There's an excellent chance that it was one or both of those elephants who appeared in Maybe's Menagerie when it toured with J.J. Nathan's American Circus and performed in Ann Arbor, Michigan on May 31st, 1861. So you can't read that, can you? Neither could I. With all that reliably in hand, I could supply a child visiting South Union from Michigan in 1862 with valid memories of an elephant. But without that confirmation, I was without an elephant, and that plot element would disappear. Either I got it right or it didn't happen. Problem solved. One elephant, two elephants. Perryville Perryville. The Battle of Perryville, Kentucky, sometimes called Chaplain Hill, on October 7th and 8th, 1862, marked the end of the conflict in eastern Kentucky and left 7,600 men dead, wounded, or missing. All things considered, it was one of the bloodiest battles of the war. According to local accounts, the ballroom of a hotel in nearby Harrodsburg was commandeered by the Army for use as a makeshift hospital. The hotel's furnishings were hastily carted up to the balcony area to save them from the carnage consigned to the ballroom floor. As the day went on, it was said, a growing pile of amputated limbs climbed higher and higher until it reached almost the height of the wall. The stench was appalling, aggravated considerably by the absence of water. A drought had dragged on for weeks, and in many ways, North and South were fighting for control of what little water could be found. But which hotel? After considerable page flipping in Kentucky libraries, the Hotel Harrod, at one time called the Avalon, was identified as the site. It was never really named in the book, but at least I knew where it was. Problem solved. And that wasn't all. I created a character who not only needed to be a serving soldier during a particular period of time, he also had to belong to a Kentucky company that served not only at Perryville, but also at the Battle of Buffington Island, Ohio. I spent the best part of a day sifting through the service records of Kentucky's many Union Army units, hoping one of them would be a fit. It's just a weirdo book about the Union, an old book that cataloged all of the Kentucky, all the Union regiments. And finally, I narrowed it down to Company K for my guy. Eventually, I found one, problem solved. This was the sort of image I was dealing with. This is what doing research by hand looks like. The original wasn't much better. And while I was nailing down a valid company for this soldier, I looked for descriptions of his cavalry uniform, especially his stripes. The need for the stripes was tangential, but I was glad to find the evidence. And sometimes one thing just led to another, and you found things. Without giving anything, has anybody read the book? Anybody? Oh, good. Thank you. God bless you. God bless you. Thank you. There are a couple of spoiler alerts in this book, so mind your own business. Without giving anything away, I'll tell you that much of what happens towards the end of Kindly Welcome depends on the pedigree of a gun. It's what Alfred Hitchcock called a MacGuffin, in that, like the Maltese Falcon in the film of the same name, it was necessary but insignificant. As a Quaker, and again in the interest of full disclosure, I'll tell you that what I don't know about guns would fill a whole bunch of books. But I needed a gun, a very specific kind of gun, the very identification of which would stop an investigation in its tracks. For obvious reasons, I was vague when I contacted the major gun companies in hopes of identifying a gun that matched my nebulous criteria. But one correspondent, who for reasons that will become clear can't be identified, said that not only did he know of such a gun, he actually had one in his collection. I asked if there was any chance he'd let me see it, and he very kindly invited me up to his home in New England. I don't believe I've ever been in a private home with more security measures in place. And the reasons why were sound. Few arsenals can contain the firepower this very kind man had in his live-in gun safe. Not only had he amassed his own collection of guns, he also owned the collection of one of the most famous names in gun history, which I'm not going to tell you. From the safe, he produced the gun of my dreams, the Edsel of the 19th century gun world, a volcanic pistol, a pump-action weapon that used not the conventional bullet casing kind of bullet, but a cone-shaped contraption that contained its own explosive. And there it is. Few had been made. It just didn't work. Parts of it were cannibalized, the pump action, things like that, but the bullet eventually was, and there's the bullet. It just didn't work. It just didn't work. It had been a spectacular failure. Not many remained in private hands, and now it was in mine. I wanted to feel the heft of it. I wanted to feel the texture. The trigger of this particular gun is a two-fingered ring, sort of. I asked if I could try it, and the owner nodded. I cocked and pulled it once, twice, a third time, at which point I realized my host had a very strange look in his eyes. I asked if he was all right. He asked if I was nearly finished. When I asked him why, he said, because the action on that gun has never been tried. Oh dear. I handed the gun back to him and he recovered straight away. A distraction seemed in order, so I asked if by any chance he had a Civil War era sniper's rifle, which of course he did. The damn thing was over 6 feet long, and I can't hazard a guess at what it weighed. I couldn't lift it without help. Visions of Bradley Cooper in American Sniper were not forthcoming. A Civil War soldier really had to want to smoke his enemy to use that thing. But this is cool. This is a great coincidence. When this nice chap and his wife bought and moved into that house, the vacating owners apologized profusely for having left so much furniture behind. It was all authentic shaker-built furniture. What were the chances? You know, these things are nuts. Sometimes, admittedly, I decided to have fun. I mean, there's only so much you can torture yourself. I decided to have fun with the research. For instance, I couldn't help wondering what spent 19th century gunpowder would have smelled like. I mean, this is how crazy I was. Just for the hell of it, I got in touch with the only soldier I knew personally, Field Marshal Sir Richard Vincent, then the United Kingdom's Chief of Defense Staff, and eventually chairman of NATO's Military Committee. I wrote to him, asked him about it, and he responded with the perfect description that this letter had to be vetted by MI6. It couldn't be mailed until MI6 had read it. I mean, crazy. Anyway, apparently that gunpowder smells like scorched metal, or did at the time. Anyway, he responded with the perfect description. There it is. How cool is that? Talk about going straight to the top. Problem solved. So sometimes it was just fun. I also sifted through hundreds of period newspapers looking for interesting bits of news I could toss in as local color, and found several, a few of which actually made it into the book. One was called Fun with F's, from a brittle fragment of the fiercely pro-slavery Louisville Courier. Illegible? Totally illegible? Hang in there. It's virtually unreadable as you now see it on the screen, and it's enough to drive anyone nuts, as you can see. Trust me, it was almost as bad in the cold light of day, but I was able to decipher it and dropped a small part of it into the book. Here's a snippet, just to give you a feel for how manic it is. My long-suffering spouse, who's a glutton for punishment, has copied it all out verbatim. And you're kindly welcome to take a complete copy home with you if you're the masochistic or sadistic type. I got plenty of copies here, but you remember it from the sickbed. On another safari, I spent several days at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers office in Vicksburg, Mississippi, delving into their records of Civil War era rivercraft and the complicated business of becoming a licensed Mississippi River pilot, as Mark Twain famously did in 1859. This is the book that you had to know, chapter and verse, every line of it. It's like the taxi driver's test in London. You could not get a license for the Mississippi without it. And since one of the segments of my book takes place on the Big River, I had to pick out an area that I especially liked, map it out, and know exactly what was on either side of the river at any given time, because I was nuts. You know, what can I tell you? While I was down there, I also camped myself in Natchez, mapping the downtown area's very seedy riverfront area and working out what was where in 1843, comparing wharf life there at the time with the type of flatboat I determined to use from all the reading I'd done in Vicksburg. And speaking of 1844, my 3 days in New Bedford, Massachusetts, make up one of the research stories readers like best. Anybody remember a band called Mountain? Mountain? Good. Anyway, you're not old enough. Anyway, their song Nantucket Sleigh Ride is one of their most well-known. The phrase itself is one I've always loved. I mean, it sings, signifying as it does the image of a whaler's boat being dragged behind a harpooned whale. Like that. I was desperate to use it in connection with a fictional character who happened also to be a sailor. But was that phrase in use in 1844, the year in question? If the answer was no, I couldn't use it. After several failed attempts to authenticate it elsewhere, I ended up at the Whaling Museum in New Bedford, which wasn't nearly as spiffy then as it is now. The staff there scratched their heads and generally admitted they'd never given it a thought before, then conceded that it was a fascinating question to which absolutely nobody knew the answer. God knows we tried. But ultimately, in sheer desperation, we had a Herman Melville moment. How had we avoided Herman Melville for 3 solid days? I mean, this is the guy who literally wrote the book on mid-19th century whaling. How did we manage not to do that? It was the last straw. Why? Anyway, Herman Melville. Herman Melville, it seemed, had been working on the manuscript of Moby Dick by 1849, and the book itself was published in 1851. The term Nantucket Sleigh Ride could be put through the Melville Concordance, but you didn't know there was one. And if it wasn't there, we had to conclude that the phrase Nantucket Sleigh Ride post-dated 1844. We put it through the concordance, it wasn't there, so the phrase was out. I had to come up with a substitute, one that still disappoints me. It had taken 3 days for Herman Melville to break my heart. On the other hand, and in the interest of modesty, anyone who doesn't know what Pink Floyd sometimes means in whaling circles can see me after class. But there were also days that made my heart sing. Both Eads and Moore's journals mark South Union's first encounter with demands by passing soldiers on August 15th, 1861. Eads' entry refers to this as a speck of war. When it turned out that those 65-plus would-be soldiers, Confederates, were the company raised by Nathan Bedford Forrest, it seemed an impossible bit of good fortune, for me anyway. A protocol for this situation had to be invented by the South Union community on the hoof, so to speak. Food for scores of men had to be found, places for soldiers to camp likewise, and there was a certain amount of petty theft that they learned to expect. Sometimes it wasn't so petty. The Shakers couldn't have known that this was to be a harbinger of the future, that this scenario would be played out again and again for 4 years, that their steadfast pacifism would offend absolutely everybody, and that no one would take into account the hardship this placed on people who were guilty of nothing more than living at the right spot at the wrong time. But Nathan Bedford Forrest, he just raised his company and was marching them to Camp Boone in Tennessee to train. You couldn't make this up. Nobody would believe it. I almost didn't believe it. But the two journals confirmed each other. In my dreams, there would be an interaction in camp between one of my fictional characters and Forrest himself. On the face of it, it was an easy call, except that the character I had in mind was a small Shaker boy. This was a perilous pairing. How would Forrest have behaved in a chance meeting with a child? I could find no mention of Forrest as the soft-hearted, touchy-feely type. Not in any of the many books that I consulted about Nathan Bedford Forrest, and there's a bookstore that deals almost entirely in books about him. I was living in Glasgow in Scotland while I was writing the first draft of Kindly Welcome, so just to get it out of my system, I did a draft of the scene I wanted so much to write. And I argued with myself, could I cross the line this one time, give myself one pass when it came to knowing what I was talking about? Herman Melville had already blindsided me. Didn't I deserve a single waiving of the rules? The best answer to that was no, which left me in a corner with only one way out. Shelby Foote, the man who literally wrote the book on the Civil War. If there was a single person on the planet who could channel the spirit of Nathan Bedford Forrest, it was Shelby Foote, who during his life was fairly circumspect about his fascination with and admiration for Forrest. I knew his address in Memphis. He was listed in the phone book till the day he died, and I knew that he was not unapproachable. On the other hand, his much-loved appearances in Ken Burns' Civil War series had opened him up to an extraordinary number of come-lately and frequently inebriated fans who wanted to relive the war with him, preferably on his front porch. He was not the type to warm to such intrusions, and I was aware that it had taken its toll on him. His health had suffered. Even if he could be the solution to my problem, was it worth it or fair for me to become one of his? Rather a lot of soul-searching went on. My intrusion, it seemed to me, was a scholarly one, and that way I was eventually able to resolve the issue in my favor. Bing. You can't read it. Don't even, it needs a magnifying glass. Foote was wonderfully kind. I should have expected as much, not least because I'd found his heart. Forrest was, he told me, and I'm quoting for all the people who can't read it up there, Forrest was indeed fond of children, his own or anybody else's. So fond indeed that he took his 15-year-old son Willie to war with him in 1861, and preceding Shiloh, borrowed Bishop Otis and General Donelson's 15-year-old sons to keep the boy company while they were in camp in Corinth. Still quoting, late in life, after the war, he demonstrated this on many occasions. Lee Merriweather, whom I knew, he was well over 100, told how Forrest took time off during a visit from friends to show this boy how a horse should be saddled properly. He did so, Meriwether said, as a way to spend time with him instead of in the dull company of grown folks. End quote. And as confirmation goes, for me, that was as good as it was going to get. Those of you who've already read the book will understand. And then he said the strangest but kindest thing of all. Quote, I hope you'll try your best to do him justice in your book. I did in mine. What an act to follow. Crazy as this may all sound now, I think Kindly Welcome, a novel of the Shakers in the Civil War, would not be the book it is without the sometimes ridiculous lengths to which I went in the interest of not getting it wrong. Many early readers of the manuscript said that they'd like to know which characters had been invented because the text seemed so authentic in general that they just couldn't tell where the line between fact and fiction lay. A foreword was therefore fashioned just to make it all abundantly clear. I didn't want accuracy to deceive anybody. In 1933, the French poet Paul Valéry said something along the lines of, a work of art is never finished, only abandoned. It's not an exact quote because I don't speak French. Nevertheless, I believe it. There came a moment when I had to let the book go. It's there to be read, learned from, and I hope to provoke, because peace is an answer and it deserves to be tried. Thank you very much.